World War II raged across land, air, and sea, but there were dangers that never appeared in history books. Far beneath the surface, in the vast darkness of the ocean, an enormous shadow moved with terrifying purpose. Survivors later described seeing jaws that could swallow lifeboats whole, and waves breaking from the sheer force of its presence. The soldiers were trained for enemies with guns and tanks, but nothing prepared them for what rose from the deep. This was no ordinary predator. It was a living nightmare, a monster the war could not overcome. The Second World War was filled with battles that scarred the earth and skies, yet beneath the surface, a different kind of war quietly brewed. Soldiers on naval ships often spoke of the waves as unpredictable, but there was something in those waters that defied explanation. Reports whispered through the ranks, not of submarines or mines, but of a force that dwarfed steel and terrified the bravest. To the men afloat, the sea was no longer just water. It was alive, watching, waiting. Nights at sea were the hardest, where darkness stretched endlessly and silence pressed heavily against the soul. The sailors had no sound but the groan of their ship and the slap of waves against its sides. Yet sometimes in the stillness came a thud, massive, deliberate, shaking hulls as if an unseen fist tested their strength. These men, hardened by war, found themselves praying not to the enemy in uniform but to what they could not see below. Survivors recounted moments when the sea seemed to pull itself apart, as if something vast moved between the layers of water. These weren't storms, and they weren't illusions of tired eyes. Entire crews saw shadows longer than battleships sliding beneath them, drifting in silence. Some swore it circled their vessels, sending ripples that rose like waves from nowhere. In those tense hours, the ocean itself felt like a battlefield where they had no weapon to fire. Warships were built to withstand bombs, torpedoes, and firepower from the strongest enemies of the time. Yet when the ocean stirred with something far greater than steel, those mighty vessels felt like toys on a pond. The metal groaned as unseen forces pressed against it. Rivets popped, and sailors clung to their stations with hearts racing. Their rifles, their cannons, their bravado, none of it mattered in the grip of the deep. Rumors spread quickly among sailors, always whispered but never shouted. They spoke of jaws the size of lifeboats and fins that sliced the water like black blades. To some, it was dismissed as fear-poisoning tired minds, but others knew the sea was ancient, older than empires and older than wars. Something lived there, something that remembered long before man first cast anchors into the ocean, and it had chosen this war to rise again. The ocean was more than a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Countless ships had sunk in its depths, their crews swallowed without ceremony. For many soldiers, this was the greatest fear, that their lives would vanish beneath waves, never to be seen again. But when whispers of monstrous shadows spread, that fear deepened into dread. They were not only afraid of sinking, but of what waited in the dark waters to finish the job. Some survivors of attacks told chilling tales. They described how lifeboats vanished without a sound, pulled down as if by invisible chains. Others said they saw massive shapes rising just enough for the moonlight to reveal ridges like mountains on a living body. These stories often ended abruptly, cut short by the silence of men who could not speak further. To remember was to relive it, and many chose not to remember at all. The officers did not encourage these tales. Fear spread faster than fire aboard ships, and superstition could cripple morale. Still, the ocean had a way of reminding men who truly held power. A scream in the night, followed by splashes too heavy to be human, was enough to undo any orders of silence. In the darkness, even discipline trembled. No commanding voice could outshout the unknown. Imagine the courage of soldiers who stormed beaches, faced tanks and charged machine guns, only to find themselves powerless in the face of water. Their bravery had limits when the enemy was unseen and unstoppable. On land, they could at least run, hide, or fight back. At sea, there was no escape. The waves themselves became prison walls, and beneath them swam a warden none could resist. War records seldom included these accounts, but scattered journals and hidden letters survived. Some spoke of teeth marks in steel hulls too wide to belong to any known creature. Others detailed encounters where entire submarines vanished without trace, leaving only oil slicks and silence behind. These weren't accidents of war, they were encounters with something the ocean birthed and man could never control. To call it a monster would almost cheapen its reality. Monsters belong to stories told around fires or whispered in trenches. This was no invention. It was flesh, blood, and hunger, moving through waters as though it ruled them. And it did. Men who faced it understood in their bones that they were trespassers in its kingdom, and it had risen to remind them of their place. When the sea swelled and a shadow broke the surface, hearts froze. Even the most hardened veterans who had survived years of combat felt their courage leave them. The sight was always fleeting, an enormous shape, a fin like a black dagger, waves cresting unnaturally high. Then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished, leaving behind silence heavier than cannon fire. That silence was the true terror, for it meant it was still out there. The ocean is vast, and in war, it became a hiding place for many horrors. Submarines lurked like predators, mines floated like death traps, and storms shattered fleets. But nothing matched the primal fear of something alive, larger than ships and hungrier than men could comprehend. War made enemies out of nations, but the ocean reminded them of a greater, ancient enemy they could never defeat. There were times when entire crews stood on deck, staring into the black waters, listening to the groan of the deep. They swore they could hear something moving far below, louder than engines, steadier than currents. The sound was rhythmic, like the beating of a giant heart. Sailors clutched their weapons, knowing all too well that their bullets would mean nothing against the Leviathan below. A few brave souls tried to dismiss it as whales or storms, clinging to logic in the face of dread. But whales could not pull ships beneath waves with a single strike. Storms did not leave behind tooth marks. This was something else, something that defied the very limits of nature as men understood it. Denial was easier than truth, but the truth never let go. It returned each time the sea stirred. In war, men were taught that enemies bled, that they could be defeated if fought hard enough. But this enemy was different. It was not driven by politics, not bound to borders, and not deterred by weapons. It simply was. Older than empires, larger than tanks, hungrier than famine. It moved where it pleased, leaving wreckage in its wake. Against it, men were not soldiers, they were prey. There are still places in the ocean that remain unexplored, trenches deeper than mountains are tall. If something survived from ancient times, it would be there. Perhaps the war disturbed its silence, the booming of bombs above shaking it awake. Perhaps it rose simply because it was hungry. Whatever the reason, soldiers found themselves in the middle of a war within a war, one their nations never prepared them for. Even after the war ended, rumors persisted. Survivors carried scars deeper than shrapnel wounds, scars carved into their minds. They saw something that no training manual ever mentioned, something that turned their view of the ocean from vast and beautiful into vast and merciless. These men returned home, but a part of them remained out there, haunted by the waves. The ocean does not reveal its secrets easily. Perhaps what the soldiers saw was one of many, a creature whose kind still roams unseen, or perhaps it was the last of its kind, roused for one final strike during mankind's greatest war. Either way, the enemy they faced was not defeated, not captured, and not forgotten. It vanished into the depths, waiting for another moment to rise. History may never fully record the battles fought in silence beneath the waves. The world remembers the armies, the generals, and the victories. But somewhere in the vast ocean, a different story lingers. One of jaws and shadows, one of survivors who swore they saw the ocean's secret enemy. And though time has buried their words, the deep remembers, it always remembers. On calm seas, a warship often felt invincible. Its steel towers, its bristling guns, and its armored hull gave men the sense of unmatched dominance. But one night, when the moonlight stretched across the ocean, something darker broke that illusion. A shadow began to drift beneath the surface, so immense that even the massive silhouette of the ship above felt small in comparison. Sailors rushed to the deck, peering over the rails, their breaths misting in the cold night air. What they saw was not a submarine, nor a drifting mass of debris. The water itself seemed to bend, folding around an outline longer than the vessel they stood upon. Murmurs rose like a tide. Some called it impossible, others whispered the word beast with trembling lips. The ocean swallowed sound, and yet the men swore they heard it move. The low groan of water shifting against bulkheads wasn't the ship's doing, it came from below. As the shadow passed, waves rolled outward, crashing against steel like fists. The men tightened their grips on the railings, realizing that the ocean had just revealed something bigger than warships and far older than steel. For all the power nations poured into their navies, they had built nothing to counter this. Their torpedoes were meant for metal hulls, their depth charges for machines, not living titans. Watching the shadow expand beneath them was like staring at a mountain shifting in slow motion. Men who had fought battles with bullets and bombs now found themselves frozen, powerless against something the size of their ship yet silent as death. The officers ordered silence, but fear has a way of finding its voice. Sailors whispered of giant sharks, of ancient legends risen from the deep. Some remembered stories from fishermen about monsters that lurked beneath waves older than mankind. Standing on deck, watching that massive shape slip beneath them, they no longer laughed at folklore. Folklore was suddenly alive, circling their hull. It wasn't just the size that terrified them, it was the deliberate way it moved. The shadow did not flee or hide. It paced as though testing the warship's presence, brushing against it just enough to remind them who ruled the ocean. Every man knew in that instant that they weren't predators on the sea. They were intruders in another's kingdom. One sailor swore he saw the fin breach the surface, rising like a blade against the silver horizon. The sight silenced the entire deck. It wasn't the sharp dorsal of a shark they had known. It was massive, jagged, and scarred, a monument of survival etched into flesh. And in its brief rise, it dwarfed the very guns that once made them feel safe. Fear clawed at the men, but curiosity anchored their eyes. How large was it truly? The warship measured hundreds of feet, yet the shadow seemed to stretch beyond. They could only guess, and each guess grew more terrifying. The thought that something could move unseen and eclipse their vessel made them realize the fragility of steel against the power of nature. Darkness thickened as clouds swallowed the moon, and the shadow below became even harder to track. The ship seemed to float above a living void, something that moved with purpose just beneath. Some men refused to look over the edge again, terrified of seeing eyes staring back at them. To meet the gaze of such a creature would be to know how small humanity truly was. The officers tried to calm the men, insisting it was a whale or drifting debris. Yet even the officers could not explain the length, the precision of its movements, or the way it circled the vessel as though deciding when to strike. Whales did not linger like that. Debris did not push against steel hulls with weight heavy enough to tilt cannons. They knew, even if they never admitted it. Days later, men still spoke of the encounter in hushed tones. The shadow became a ghost on the ship, haunting every conversation, filling the silence between orders. At night, when the water lapped against the hull, they swore it had returned, following them still. Their dreams were not of enemy planes or gunfire. They were of that endless shadow rising once more. The scale of it shook their understanding of the sea. Warships were designed to dominate oceans, to be symbols of supremacy, yet this single shadow reduced all that to arrogance. It didn't matter how many guns bristled on deck. Against something so vast, their firepower seemed like children throwing stones into the tide. The warship was no longer king. It was prey drifting in borrowed territory. Some men tried to rationalize what they saw, sketching diagrams, comparing notes, but the math never added up. The length exceeded known creatures, the movement too deliberate, the silence too unnatural. Science offered them nothing to hold on to. Logic failed when confronted with something that should not exist yet clearly did. Others turned to faith, whispering prayers into the salty wind, convinced they had glimpsed a judgment sent by the sea itself. To them, it was not merely a beast but a warning, a reminder that war was small in the grand scale of creation. Their guns and bombs could level cities, yet a single creature in the ocean humbled them more than all their battles combined. As the warship pressed onward through hostile waters, the shadow eventually slipped away, vanishing into the abyss as silently as it had come. Relief rippled through the crew, but unease lingered. If something so large could appear and disappear at will, then the ocean was not empty. It was occupied, and they were trespassers sailing above giants. The encounter changed how the men looked at the sea. Every ripple seemed suspicious. Every swell a potential threat. They no longer leaned casually against the rails or slept peacefully at night. The sea was no longer their highway. It was a ceiling above something vast and unknown. And once a shadow that large is seen, it can never be unseen. Some sailors never returned home to tell their stories. Their ships swallowed by the war or by the sea. Yet those who survived carried the memory with them forever. In bars, around campfires, and in hushed confessions, they spoke of it, the shadow larger than warships. Each retelling carried the same weight, the same dread, as though even memory was dangerous to speak aloud. The legacy of that encounter outlasted the war. Historians spoke of tactics, strategies, and victories, but never of the battles fought against fear itself. The men who had looked down into the deep carried scars unseen, scars shaped like shadows in moonlit water. Their silence became its own testimony, a silence more powerful than any written record. To this day, the ocean guards its secrets. Modern ships, satellites, and sonar probe its depths, yet shadows still move where instruments fail. What the soldiers saw may never be proven, but proof was never the point. The point was that men, with all their machines and weapons, found themselves dwarfed by something that refused to be measured or named. The shadow became legend, a story told with trembling conviction. It was not an enemy that could be defeated, nor a prize that could be claimed. It was a reminder of humility, of fear, of awe in the face of nature's forgotten titans. For those who saw it, the war was no longer the greatest battle. They had glimpsed something far older, a shadow larger than warships. The ocean was calm for a brief moment, almost too calm for men who had grown used to chaos. Then it came a surge from below that shook the vessel as though the sea itself had turned against them. The sailors staggered, their hands gripping cold steel railings, as something vast and unseen rammed the hull. The clash of iron and the raw force of nature sent terror racing down their spines. When the steel first groaned, they thought it was a torpedo, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the sharp crack of an explosion, but a grinding, splintering wail that came from beneath. The hull screamed as if alive, bending under pressure no machine was built to withstand. They realized with horror that teeth had met their ship's armor. One sailor peered over the edge, his breath catching as bubbles and churned water rose in thick clouds. Out of that violent froth, he swore he saw the silhouette of jaws wider than the deck itself. The teeth glinted faintly, each longer than a man's arm, tearing at the steel as if it were nothing but thin tin. His scream was drowned by the roar of the sea. The ship shook again, rivets popping loose as bolts rained across the deck. Men scrambled, some firing rifles into the water, though no target could be seen. The bullets were swallowed by the waves, but the thrashing from below continued. They weren't facing a submarine or an enemy fleet. It was something alive, primal, and endlessly strong. As the grinding continued, officers shouted commands, their voices trembling despite their authority. "Patch the hull! Brace yourselves!" Yet no order could prepare them for the sound of steel plates buckling like paper. The ocean itself seemed to laugh as the predator scraped and bit its way along the belly of the ship, testing its strength against mankind's greatest creation. Sparks flew as jaws clamped against the keel, sending shudders across the entire vessel. The men felt the deck ripple beneath their boots as if they were standing on the back of a living thing. For the first time in their military service, guns and training meant nothing. They were soldiers stripped of power, prey before a monster born of depths. A lookout shouted from above, his voice cracking as he pointed toward the waterline. The beast's dorsal ridge scraped the surface, tearing a white scar across the waves. For a brief instant, it rose higher, massive and sleek, before plunging down again, dragging more steel with it. The sight left hardened veterans speechless, their courage drowned in disbelief. The engineers below deck fought desperately to seal the leaks, hammering plates and stuffing cloth into gaping wounds. But the sound of claws, or were they teeth, continued to gnaw at the ship's belly. The hull was their shield, their only barrier between survival and the abyss, and now it was being eaten alive. Each groan echoed like a death rattle. The captain's hands trembled on the wheel, his knuckles white as he barked for evasive maneuvers. But how do you outmaneuver something faster than a submarine and stronger than torpedoes? The ship turned sharply, engines roaring, yet the Predator clung to its side. The men could feel its weight dragging them down, dragging them closer to a watery grave. A sailor dropped to his knees, clutching the deck as a massive blow hurled him across it. His helmet rolled into the sea, vanishing instantly. He whispered prayers, his lips quivering, knowing full well that no weapon in their arsenal could silence the force beneath them. Faith became the last weapon they had left. The screeching grew unbearable as steel tore away in sheets, tossed into the waves like discarded scraps. Men covered their ears, the sound piercing deeper than explosions ever had. It was the sound of defeat, of man's strongest invention being reduced to fragments by something nature had hidden for eons. Their war was against a beast no bullet could conquer. A young officer tried to rally the crew, shouting about bravery and duty, but his words dissolved into silence as another section of the hull bent inward with a thunderous crack. Bravery seemed meaningless when confronted with the raw force of teeth grinding through the ship's very heart. Men who had faced bombs without flinching now shook uncontrollably. For a fleeting moment, the beast let go, leaving the ship drifting heavily. The silence was worse than the chaos. It felt like the calm before a final strike. Every man held his breath, waiting, praying, knowing the ocean had not finished with them. The tension was suffocating, heavier than the salt air around them. Then came the upward strike. The monster rammed again, this time tearing a gash across the side that sent water flooding in. The steel sang like a bell, reverberating through every bone in their bodies. Men scrambled with buckets, pumps, anything they could use to fight the rising tide. But deep inside, they knew it was hopeless. A soldier fired a mounted machine gun blindly into the sea, the bullets tracing lines of foam across the waves. The men watched in desperation, hoping to wound the unseen beast. But the ocean only answered with another crunch, another reminder that their weapons were as useless as sticks against a storm. The futility sank deeper than the flooding water. The ship leaned heavily to one side, alarms blaring as the crew fought to stabilize. Some swore they saw a shadow circling below, wider than the ship itself, waiting for its moment to strike again. Their greatest fear wasn't death by drowning, but being dragged down alive, piece by piece, inside the jaws of that thing. The veterans who had once spoken proudly of surviving battles now stared blankly at the water. They knew that their medals and training had no meaning here. Against enemies of flesh and blood, they had fought with honor. But against the abyss, against something older than history, they were powerless children with toys made of steel. The Predator struck again, and the ship's frame shrieked as though crying out in agony. Men clutched each other, some shouting, others weeping, their courage dissolved by the sound of their sanctuary being devoured. Steel was their armor, but even armor has limits, and this beast was teaching them that lesson with merciless precision. The ship still floated, barely, its engines groaning as they tried to pull free. But every movement, every churn of the propellers, only seemed to anger the Predator. They weren't navigating the sea anymore. They were trapped in its jaws, carried wherever it pleased. The soldiers realized they were no longer in control. They were cargo for a monster. When steel met teeth, man met his humbling. Their war, their weapons, their courage, all reduced to trembling flesh on a failing deck. The ocean had shown them its secret, and it was far deadlier than anything on land. As the ship groaned one final time, they understood the truth. Steel bends, teeth endure, and the deep never forgets. When the chaos finally faded, the ocean grew still again, but the men who had lived through it carried silence heavier than the wreckage itself. They had seen things no training manual could prepare them for. Teeth, shadows, and a power that mocked steel. These memories burned deeper than any scar. Words failed them, for even to describe it seemed to invite it back. Survivors sat in the dim light of the damaged vessel, staring at one another with hollow eyes. They had endured shellfire and enemy fleets, yet this was different. The ocean had turned into a predator, and they had become prey. To speak of it felt dangerous, like opening a door to something that should never return. So they kept their voices low, or not at all. One sailor gripped a soaked journal in his trembling hands. He wanted to write, to capture what had happened, but the pen hovered over the page without moving. How could he put into words the feeling of being hunted by something larger than a warship? He closed the book, sealing the truth inside his own silence. At night, the survivors lay awake, listening to every ripple against the hull as if the beast still circled them. Some swore they heard low groans beneath the water, a reminder that the sea had not forgotten them. Each sound was a haunting echo, and no man dared to speak of it out loud. To do so was to admit they were still vulnerable. When rescue ships finally came, the survivors said little. They described an attack but left out the size, the shadow, the teeth that tore through steel. Their rescuers assumed torpedoes or mines, nodding sympathetically, unaware of the truth that hid behind the silence. The men let them believe it, because the truth was far too heavy to carry openly. In the debriefing rooms, officers pressed for details, but the survivors' answers were clipped and vague. It was sudden, something hit us. The hull cracked. Their voices faltered whenever the questioning pushed too far. The unspoken terror lingered between them, thick as smoke. They had sworn silently, without words, to bury the nightmare beneath their silence. Some survivors found themselves haunted by dreams. In their sleep, they heard the screech of steel, the grinding bite of unseen jaws, and woke drenched in sweat. They would sit up, trembling, staring into the dark corners of their quarters. Yet when morning came, they said nothing. They knew others dreamed the same, but no one dared to confirm it aloud. A soldier who once sang loudly on deck now spoke rarely, his voice reduced to whispers. His comrades noticed, but no one questioned him. They too felt their voices slipping away, taken by the same shadow that had risen from the deep. The monster had stolen more than steel. It had stolen their words. On shore leave, some tried to explain their trauma to families, but the words dissolved on their tongues. How could a man tell his wife that a mouth larger than their home had tried to consume him? How could he tell his children that steel was useless in the face of something older than war? Instead, he said only, "It was bad," and silence filled the rest. The few who tried to tell their stories met disbelief. Listeners laughed nervously, dismissing the tales as exaggerations of men too long at sea. The survivors quickly learned that silence was easier than ridicule. They carried the weight alone, their truths becoming ghosts that lived only inside their minds. Silence became a shield, but it was also a prison. The survivors carried the memory like chains, every creak of a floorboard or clap of thunder dragging them back to the ocean. They longed to release it, to scream out what they had seen, but their throats locked tight, as if the ocean itself forbade them from speaking. Some grew superstitious, believing that the beast could hear its own name. They thought that to speak of it was to summon it, to invite it back from the depths. And so, even in drunken gatherings where war stories were told boldly, this one never surfaced. The silence was a pact, a desperate attempt to keep the terror buried. The men who survived wore the same haunted look in their eyes. Their comrades noticed it, but few dared to ask. It was the look of men who had seen a predator too large for imagination, and who had lived knowing it could return. That look said more than words ever could, and yet, even then, no one explained. Years later, when veterans gathered, their stories poured out about battles and close calls, but this one remained untold. A hush would fall whenever someone brushed near the subject, and eyes would dart to the floor. The silence had become tradition, passed along as surely as medals and scars. Historians who later interviewed them were puzzled by the gaps in their recollections. Whole nights of the war seemed to vanish in their testimonies. The silence was so uniform it seemed rehearsed, but in truth, it was born of terror too deep for words. The monster had left no trace except in the souls of its witnesses. A few survivors carried drawings in their pockets, rough sketches of shadows and teeth done in secret. They never showed them, never explained them, but kept them close like forbidden relics. When they died, the sketches sometimes surfaced, baffling families who could not understand the fear etched into every stroke of the pencil. The silence followed them to their graves. Obituaries spoke of bravery, service, and sacrifice. but never mentioned the night when the ocean revealed its hidden terror. The truth was lowered into the earth with them, sealed beneath stone and dirt. The deep had claimed not only steel, but also stories. What frightened them most was not that the beast attacked, but that it let them live. They wondered if survival had been a choice, a cruel mercy granted by something too powerful to fear men. That thought festered in their minds, leaving them forever uncertain. Why them? Why spare them? Silence was their only way to cope. Generations later, whispers of the tale surfaced, but always half-formed, always uncertain. The survivors' silence had blurred the truth, leaving only fragments that sounded like myth. And yet, those who looked into the survivors' eyes when the subject was brushed knew there was no fiction there. The silence itself was proof. The terror that silenced survivors was not just a beast from the deep. It was the knowledge that the ocean held powers far greater than war, far older than mankind's machines. To speak of it was to admit that no steel, no strategy, no soldier could ever truly be safe. And so, silence became their last defense. History books are full of battles, dates, and victories, yet they rarely speak of what lurked beneath the waves. Wars are remembered by the clash of nations, but the ocean holds stories it refuses to release. Among these is the tale of a predator so immense and so terrifying that survivors buried it under silence, and historians turned their eyes away. The official records of the Second World War speak of sunken vessels, unknown causes, and unexplained wreckage. But behind those vague entries lies something darker. The truth was too wild, too impossible to inscribe on paper without being dismissed. So, the predator was hidden, camouflaged by bureaucracy, erased in ink before it could ever take root in history. Survivors whispered that the ocean itself conspired with governments to keep the secret. After all, what would it mean if men had faced not only enemies with rifles, but also an ancient monster of the deep? Nations struggled to rebuild. They did not want legends of leviathans rising to weaken morale. Silence was easier than truth. Evidence was scattered across the seas. Ships torn in half without a single torpedo strike, crews missing without distress. Culls, lifeboats found adrift with claw-like gouges along their sides. Yet the reports were filed away, dismissed as accidents, mines, or storms. Convenient lies replaced inconvenient truths, burying the predator under a mountain of official explanations. Some sailors insisted on writing letters home that described what they saw. Many of these letters never made it past military censors. Families received vague notices of death, stripped of the details that might reveal something unimaginable. The predator's presence was carefully smothered, even as it roamed freely beneath the waters. Those who dared to speak publicly were quickly silenced. Some were labeled unstable, their reputations dismantled by those who feared panic. Others were simply ignored, their warnings swallowed by the noise of a world desperate to move past war. Their words faded, but the memories never did. Yet the ocean left scars too deep to erase. Veterans carried the weight of what they saw, long after their governments tried to bury the story. At night, they would wake sweating, still hearing the sound of steel being ripped apart like cloth. They knew the truth, even if no book or monument dared to admit it. The predator's size was its greatest weapon, but its secrecy was its greatest shield. For decades, oceans remained uncharted and mysterious, leaving plenty of room for something vast to hide. History may have tried to bury it, but the sea provided all the cover it needed to remain alive, undetected, and hungry. A handful of wartime researchers left behind cryptic notes in personal journals. References to abnormal pressure waves, massive unidentified aquatic body, and subsurface strikes suggest that not everyone ignored the truth. But these scraps were scattered and incomplete, dismissed as the fevered notes of men under stress. Still, they form a puzzle hinting at what was buried. Over time, whispers spread among sailors and fishermen. A story here, a warning there, accounts of shadows larger than ships and waters stirred by something unseen. These fragments stitch together a quiet oral history, carried not by scholars but by those who lived closest to the sea. The predator was buried from the record, but not from memory. Fear became the predator's camouflage. Few wanted to believe that something like this existed, To acknowledge it was to accept that humanity was not the master of the oceans, but a fragile guest. And so, denial did the work of silence. The predator was buried not only by governments, but by the human need to forget. As decades passed, wrecks still appeared in ways that puzzled investigators. Some blamed currents, storms, or even enemy mines left over from the war. But those who studied closely saw the same haunting pattern, metal bent inward as if bitten, destruction too precise to be random. The predator's signature lived on, hidden beneath misdirection. A few historians dared to dig deeper. They pieced together records, testimony, and wreckage, only to find themselves met with closed archives and missing documents. Files were redacted or destroyed, as if someone had gone out of their way to erase the predator from collective memory. What was left was a trail of shadows pointing to a truth no one wanted to see. For the men who knew, silence was not just protection, it was survival. They feared that the more people spoke of it, the more power the predator would hold, as though its legend could summon it back from the deep. To bury it in silence was to hope it would stay buried in the ocean as well. Yet the ocean is not easily silenced. Storms shift, currents rise, and sometimes wreckage resurfaces. Fishermen have reported pulling up twisted steel fragments unlike any damage known from torpedoes. Each time the question arises, what could do this? Each time the official answer buries the truth again. Myths of sea monsters have existed for centuries. But this was no myth, it was flesh and bone, scale and tooth. History tried to file it under legend, to blur it into stories of sailors' superstition, but the survivors knew better. They had seen it with their own eyes, and the silence around it was a graveyard for truth. The predator's true victory was not in the ships it dragged under, but in how thoroughly it erased itself from history's pages. Wars are remembered for what men did to one another, not for what rose from the sea. And so, its story slipped into the shadows, hidden not only in the deep, but in the spaces between words. Even now, divers exploring forgotten wrecks sometimes stumble on evidence that does not match historical explanations. Jagged breaks, twisted steel, and gaping holes too large for minds tell their own story. The sea does not forget, even if history does. The predator's presence lingers, waiting for those who look too closely. What makes this silence more terrifying is that no one can say the predator is gone. It has never been captured, never killed, never studied. To bury something in history does not mean it is buried in reality. It waits, hidden in the same waters where the survivors first glimpsed it, watching from below. The predator history tried to bury is still alive in the shadows of the sea. The silence around it is not a shield but a warning, passed down through fragments and whispers. For as long as humanity sails the oceans, the question will remain, did we bury the predator in history, or did we only bury the truth about what still waits beneath? Long after the guns of war fell silent, the ocean continued to murmur with secrets. Waves lapped against forgotten wrecks, carrying echoes of screams swallowed by salt and steel. Sailors who spent nights at sea claimed to hear voices on the wind, faint, broken, as if rising from the very depths where their comrades had vanished. The sea spoke, but in whispers too chilling to ignore. Survivors swore that silence on deck was the only way to keep the whispers at bay. Whenever men lingered too long by the railings at night, they felt drawn toward the black waters. Some said the whispers were not sounds but thoughts, alien and invasive, pushing into the human mind. The deep had its own language, and only those marked by fear could hear it. Fishermen told stories of nets pulling up strange fragments, bones too large to be whales, scales thicker than armor plates. Alongside these remains came a sense of unease, as if the ocean itself disapproved of their discovery. The whispers seemed to grow louder near these finds, urging the men to return what did not belong to them. Most obeyed without question. Divers who explored sunken ships often surfaced pale and trembling. They spoke of shadows brushing past them, shapes moving just beyond the reach of their lamps. Worse still, some claimed to hear faint calls, pleas for help from voices long dead. These whispers wrapped around them like currents, dragging them back toward the wrecks until they fled in panic. In coastal villages, old sailors warned of certain nights when the ocean spoke louder. Storms would churn the water, and amid the thunder, faint cries could be heard. Some describe them as the screams of soldiers who never made it home, others as the growl of the monster that claimed them. Either way, few dared to sail when the whispers rose. Records exist of naval crews abandoning missions after strange nights at sea. Logs mention unsettling disturbances and auditory illusions. The officers avoided detail, but witnesses later admitted to hearing whispers rising from below deck, echoing through steel as though the ship itself had learned to speak. No one slept, and many prayed in silence until daylight came. For some survivors, the whispers never left. Even on dry land, in quiet rooms, they would hear the faint sound of rushing water followed by broken words. They lived in dread of silence, for it was in the quiet that the ocean's voice crept back into their ears. They aged quickly, burdened by whispers that did not belong to this world. A theory spread among superstitious sailors. The predator of the deep did not simply kill, it marked. Those who survived were forever tied to it, carrying fragments of its presence within their minds. The whispers were not ghosts or hallucinations, but messages from the abyss, reminders that the predator was still watching. Some men tried to drown the whispers with drink, but even intoxication could not silence them fully. Instead, the voices became distorted, echoing louder in drunken minds. A few were driven to madness, convinced they had been chosen as messengers of the sea. Their words made no sense to others, but to them the whispers were commands. Ships passing near old battle sites often reported strange malfunctions. Radios picked up static that, to some ears, carried faint patterns resembling human speech. Engineers dismissed it as interference, but the crews grew uneasy. They swore the voices in the static were calling their names. The ocean's whispers had found a new medium. Families of lost sailors sometimes reported dreams in which their loved ones appeared, soaked in broken, whispering warnings. These dreams were so vivid that some awoke convinced they had truly been visited. The ocean seemed to reach into sleep itself, using whispers as a bridge between the drowned and the living. Legends grew with each generation. In hushed tones, elders told children never to mock the sea, for it listens. They said the whispers were not merely memories, but promises, the ocean reminding mankind that it had not forgotten what was taken, nor forgiven what was disturbed. To disrespect the sea was to invite its whispers into your own life. Archaeologists investigating shipwrecks described an unnatural heaviness under the water. One diver claimed he felt words vibrating through his bones, though no sound was heard through his helmet. He surfaced gasping, unable to explain the experience. The whispers, it seemed, were not always meant for ears. They could burrow directly into the body. In rare cases, groups of men reported hearing the same words at once. Witnesses on separate ships, miles apart, recalled the exact same phrase carried by the wind. Still here. Such accounts were dismissed by officials, but among sailors, these synchronized whispers became proof that something intelligent lay in the deep, reaching out when it wished. Scientists who attempted to study the phenomena often abandoned their projects. Recording devices picked up only static and water, but those present during tests swore they heard whispers in real time. The inability to capture them convinced some that the voices were selective, choosing who could hear them and when. Survivors rarely spoke of the content of the whispers. A few hinted that they carried warnings like "don't return" or "it waits." Others believed the voices were taunts, mocking men for daring to think themselves rulers of the sea. Either way, the message was clear. The ocean did not forget. Rumors persisted of entire crews deserting in the night after long exposure to the whispers. Ships were found adrift, intact but abandoned, with journals left behind describing voices that grew louder and more commanding each day. The men had simply vanished, leaving only their fear behind. Whispers were often strongest near deep trenches, where the ocean floor dropped into darkness. Sailors avoided these routes when possible, convinced that the predator still lingered there. The trenches were its cathedral, and the whispers its hymns, a reminder of who truly ruled the waters. Even now, modern ships report unexplained sounds at night. Recordings of whale songs sometimes reveal undertones too structured to be natural. Analysts hear patterns, even syllables, though no one dares to name them. The ocean keeps whispering, just enough to remind humanity of its silence and its secrets. The whispers from the sunken deep are not just echoes of the past. They are proof of something still alive, something waiting. History may bury the predator, and survivors may silence their voices, but the ocean itself does not forget. It remembers, it whispers, and perhaps one day it will rise to speak louder than ever before. Some creatures leave behind bones, fossils, and tracks to prove they existed. But the monster of the deep left nothing tangible, only stories, scars, and silence. Its legacy was not in what could be studied, but in what could not be explained. Men feared the absence more than the presence, for what cannot be seen cannot be controlled. The predator's attacks were sudden and absolute, leaving no time for understanding. Ships vanished, crews were lost, and survivors carried nothing but fragmented memories. This absence of evidence became its strongest proof. Legends grow from what remains hidden, and the ocean seemed determined to guard the monster's image as carefully as it guarded its depths. The legacy of this unseen beast became a kind of shadow religion among sailors. They spoke of it in whispers, as if naming it would summon it back. Young recruits rolled their eyes at the tales, but veterans carried the weight of those stories in their posture, their silence, and their prayers before setting sail. Each generation added new details, not from discovery, but from imagination. The less men saw of the predator, the larger it became in their minds. By the time decades had passed, it was no longer a single beast. It was the ocean itself, weaponized by something beyond human comprehension. Its unseen nature gave it infinite size. Survivors who lived to old age described the same haunted feeling, the sense of being watched. Even years later, standing on solid ground, they felt the monster beneath their feet, separated only by the crust of the earth. For them, the predator was not gone. It had simply shifted position, waiting for the right tide. No artist could capture its form, and no scientist could confirm its existence. But sailors insisted its legacy was carved into their souls. They bore nightmares instead of evidence, carrying visions that felt too real to be dismissed. The unseen monster became proof that sometimes reality is shaped more by fear than by fact. Naval archives recorded patterns of disappearance too consistent to dismiss. Entire ships erased from history, their routes vanishing mid-ocean without debris. Officials blamed storms, yet those who sailed the same waters later reported feeling an unshakable dread. The legacy was not just the stories of the lost, but the silence left behind. Even the waters where attacks had once occurred seemed different. Fishermen avoided them, claiming the currents pulled strangely, as if the ocean remembered. Some said the monster had left its mark, altering the sea itself. To enter those waters was not simply to risk drowning. It was to trespass on haunted ground. The unseen nature of the predator gave rise to countless interpretations. Some believed it was an ancient beast, older than whales and sharks. Others thought it was something beyond biology, an intelligence dwelling in the abyss. Whatever it was, its legacy was to remind mankind that the deepest places were never truly ours. In stories, the predator often became a metaphor. Poets called it the ocean's anger. Historians labeled it a ghost of war, and philosophers claimed it represented the limits of human knowledge. Yet behind the metaphors, survivors held to one truth: the monster was real, and it was still unseen. Even modern technology has failed to capture proof. Sonar scans reveal shapes that vanish when pursued. Cameras return footage too murky to decipher, as if the ocean itself conspires to keep the predator hidden. The absence of evidence has not silenced belief, it has only deepened it. Whispers among sailors say the monster's legacy is not in its body, but in its will, that it chooses when to appear and who may glimpse it. This selective haunting explains why some men never see it, while others never forget it. The unseen predator is not random. It is deliberate. Folklore paints the predator as an immortal keeper of balance. Just as storms cleanse the sea and volcanoes renew the land, the monster exists to humble mankind. Ships that grew too bold, wars that turned oceans into graveyards, were reminders to the deep. Its legacy was to remind humanity that no empire could outlast the sea. Sailors often compared the silence after an encounter to a sermon. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one questioned. The monster left behind no body, no wreckage, only a silence so thick it became sacred. Its unseen presence was enough to command obedience more than any admiral could. The legacy also carried into ports and homes. Wives and children of lost sailors grew up with an unspoken enemy, an unseen monster that had stolen fathers and brothers. Families mourned ghosts, never bodies. The predator became part of grief itself, an invisible thief tied to every tear shed on shore. Some survivors describe the legacy not as terror, but as a strange kind of respect. To face something vast and unseen was to feel human fragility in its purest form. The monster did not need to roar or reveal itself, it only needed to exist, and men understood their place. Its legacy was humility. Legends say the monster was never meant to be killed. Unlike whales or sharks, it was not prey, nor predator in the ordinary sense. It was guardian, judge, and reminder. Its unseen existence preserved the balance of fear that kept mankind from devouring the ocean completely. Its legacy was restraint, written in dread. Modern sailors, though armed with stronger ships and sharper tools, still speak cautiously of the old stories. They know better than to dismiss them fully. The ocean is too vast, and humanity still too small. The unseen monster may no longer strike openly, but its legacy whispers in the silence every time a vessel drifts over deep water. What remains most haunting is the uncertainty. If the predator still exists, then it waits. If it is gone, then its absence itself is a warning. Something greater once ruled these waters, and nothing prevents it, or something worse, from returning. Its unseen legacy is the permanent question mark over the sea. The legacy of a monster unseen is not measured in bones or fossils, but in memory and myth. It is carried in the silence of sailors, the fear in storms, the hesitation in voyages across dark trenches. The predator does not need to be seen to be remembered. Its power is eternal because its form remains forever hidden. The ocean still holds secrets, and some say it keeps the darkest ones hidden in its deepest trenches. For those who survived, the memory was more haunting than the war itself, a reminder that not every battle can be recorded in history, and not every enemy can be defeated by force. The guns and bombs of World War II eventually fell silent, but the monster that surfaced beneath those waters left behind questions that can never truly be answered. Was it a fleeting encounter, or proof that something beyond imagination still roams the depths? One thing is certain, the sea remembers what mankind wishes to forget.